What would you do if your phone rang after midnight and the voice on the other end didn't sound like your adult child anymore, but like the scared little boy you once carried through fevers and nightmares? Because that was the sound that ripped me out of sleep at 12:08 a.m., my name shaking in his mouth like it might fall apart if he said it too loud, and before I could even ask what was wrong, he was already begging. Already drowning, already telling me he was ruined, that everything was collapsing, that if I didn't help him right now, he didn't know how he'd survive. And in that moment, I wasn't a woman in her quiet Texas bedroom with a ticking clock and a half folded blanket at the foot of the bed. I was just his mother again, sitting up too fast, heart slamming. One hand gripping the phone and the other reaching for the lamp as if light alone could fix whatever darkness had found him. And when I told him to slow down, to breathe, to tell me what happened, the words came spilling out in fragments. About bad decisions and faster ones, about crypto and promises, and a market that fell harder than he ever imagined, about loans stacked on loans, about a second mortgage he took without really understanding what that meant, about people who wanted real money now, not excuses, not apologies. And when he finally whispered the number $80,000, it didn't sound like math, it sounded like a confession. And I remember staring at the chipped dresser across from my bed, the old graduation photo on top, the same photo I dust every Sunday without thinking, and realizing my entire world barely added up to half of what he needed. Yet somehow he was asking me to save him anyway, and even then, even with fear crawling up my spine, I didn't say no, because when your child tells you he's about to lose his home, his family, his life, you don't start calculating risk, you start calculating how much of yourself you can give before you disappear. And as he kept talking, voice cracking, telling me his wife didn't know the full truth, that if she found out she might leave, that every knock at the door felt like the end, I felt something settle in my chest, heavy and quiet, the kind of decision that doesn't feel heroic or dramatic, just final. And when the call ended with a promise to talk in the morning, I didn't go back to bed. I sat at the kitchen table with my old coffee mug, watching the dark slowly thin into dawn, knowing that by the time the sun came up, something in my life would already be gone. And here's the part no one tells you about moments like that, the part that hooks you later when you look back. It's not the fear that hurts the most, it's the certainty. The certainty that if you don't help, you'll never forgive yourself, and if you do help, you might never recover, but you choose the pain you know how to live with. And by morning, I had chosen him again. Even though some small voice whispered that this was different, that this wasn't help, it was erasure, and still I drove to the bank with shaking hands and a purse full of old papers, sitting across from a woman who warned me gently that I was risking my retirement, my home, my future. And I nodded because those words didn't scare me as much as the idea of my son calling me again and hearing defeat instead of hope. And over the next 2 weeks, I dismantled my life quietly, selling the house I had filled with memories, moving into a rental near the church, emptying savings I had built penny by penny, pulling from a retirement fund that was supposed to carry me through old age. And when I finally held the cashier's check in my hands, $80,000 printed clean and cold, it felt less like money and more like a verdict. And when I met my son at the bank and watched his shoulders drop as the debt disappeared, when he hugged me like a man pulled back from the edge and told me he owed me his life, I wanted to believe this was the turning point, the moment love would be returned instead of consumed, and when he asked me to stay with them, said it was only fair that he'd take care of me now, I nodded because exhaustion makes promises sound real. And as we walked out into the Texas sun, I told myself this was what mothers do. They step forward when everything else falls apart. They don't keep score. They don't read receipts. They don't imagine a future where the door they saved would one day be closed to them. And if you're listening to this thinking you would have done the same, that you would have answered that call, signed those papers, given that money without hesitation, then you already understand the trap. Because love doesn't announce when it's about to be mistaken for obligation. It just asks quietly and waits to see how much you're willing to lose. And I didn't know it yet, but that midnight call wasn't the beginning of his rescue. It was the beginning of my undoing. And the next time my phone rang, the voice on the other end wouldn't be begging for help at all. Have you ever signed your name knowing that the ink was heavier than the paper? Because that's what it felt like sitting across from the loan officer that morning. Her voice calm and practiced as she explained risks I already understood but didn't want to hear, warning me that once this was done, there was no rewind button, no quiet way to undo it, no guarantee I'd land on my feet. And still I nodded because fear for yourself is manageable, but fear for your child feels unbearable. and as she slid the documents toward me. I remember thinking how strange it was that something so life-altering could look so ordinary, just pages and boxes and lines, no alarms, no red lights, no final warning that said, "This is where everything changes." And maybe that's why so many people ruin their own lives quietly, because disaster doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it whispers politely and waits for your signature. And while my hand moved, my mind kept circling the same thought, that I wasn't doing this because I was naive or weak. I was doing it because I remembered the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. The boys who once held my hand at the grocery store like the world might swallow him whole if he let go. And if you've ever been a parent, you know how memories like that don't fade. They sit behind your eyes and step forward exactly when they're least convenient. And as the pen scratched across the page, I told myself this was temporary, that money could be rebuilt, that houses were just walls. That love was the only thing that mattered. And isn't that the lie we tell ourselves when we're about to overgive? That love somehow makes consequences disappear. And in the weeks that followed, I moved through my life like a ghost, packing up someone else's memories, selling the house I thought I'd grow old in, folding away curtains I had chosen with care, running my hand one last time along the doorframe where I'd marked my son's height year after year, each mark a reminder of time passing, whether you're ready or not. And every box I taped shut felt like a question I didn't want to answer yet, because once you dismantle your safety, you don't get to pretend you're just helping, you're all in, and people will tell you that sacrifice is noble, that mothers are strong, that love requires pain. But what they don't tell you is how lonely sacrifice feels when no one is standing beside you asking what it costs. And during those days, my son called often, his voice lighter now. Relief creeping in, talking about how everything would be different once this was behind them, how grateful he was, how he couldn't have done it without me. And each time he said that, something in me relaxed just enough to keep going. Because gratitude is addictive when you've gone too long without hearing it. And I clung to those words the way tired people cling to promises. And when the final transfer cleared and the debt vanished from his life like it had never existed, I expected some kind of moment, a pause, a recognition of what had just happened. But the bank didn't clap, the world didn't stop. The sun came up like it always did, and that's when I realized something important. That the world doesn't acknowledge your sacrifice. Only the people who benefit from it do, and sometimes even they forget. And when my son suggested I move in with them, said it would save me money, that I shouldn't be alone in some small apartment after everything I'd done, I felt that familiar pull again, that mixture of relief and hope, because the idea of being welcomed felt like proof that none of this had been a mistake. And if you've ever needed validation badly enough, you know how easy it is to mistake convenience for care. And as I packed what little I had left and drove toward their house, I told myself this was a new chapter. That this was how families worked, that I was finally moving toward something instead of giving things away. And for a brief moment it felt true. Mornings with noise instead of silence, shared meals, the comfort of not being alone. But even then, even in those early days, there were signs I ignored, small shifts in tone, pauses that lingered too long, smiles that didn't reach the eyes. And I told myself I was imagining it because that's what people do when reality threatens the story they need to believe. And maybe you're listening to this thinking you would have noticed, that you wouldn't have ignored those signals. But love doesn't sharpen your instincts, it dulls them. It makes you generous when you should be cautious, patient when you should ask questions, and willing to explain away discomfort because confronting it feels like admitting you've made a mistake you can't afford to acknowledge. And the truth is, by the time you realize the cost of what you've signed, it's already been deducted. Not just from your bank account, but from your sense of place, your independence, your right to take up space without apology. And I didn't know it yet, but the price of being a mother wasn't finished collecting. It was only waiting for the moment when I'd need something in return, because the next shift wouldn't come from a bank or a signature. It would come from inside that house, quietly, slowly. Until one day I would realize I was living somewhere I was no longer welcome. And when that realization finally hit, there would be no paperwork to protect me at all. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like the air shifted just because you were there? Because that was the feeling that crept in long before anyone ever said a word to me, back when I still believed I was welcome. Back when I thought sharing a roof meant sharing respect, and at first everything looked right on the surface. Shared dinners, polite smiles, the sound of children running down the hallway, but beneath that surface there was a quiet recalibration happening. One I didn't notice until I was already standing in the wrong place too often, sitting in the wrong chair too long, existing a little louder than anyone wanted. And if you've ever slowly realized you've outstayed a welcome no one officially gave you, then you know how confusing it feels because nothing is said outright. There's no argument to respond to. Just subtle shifts that make you question yourself, like when the kitchen suddenly feels crowded only when you're in it, or when conversations pause the moment you walk in, or when laughter resumes only after you've left the room. And I told myself I was imagining it because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting that the safety I thought I'd secured with sacrifice was already dissolving. And the first month passed easily enough. I helped where I could, cooked meals, folded laundry, picked up groceries, not because anyone asked me to, but because usefulness feels like currency when you're afraid of becoming a burden, and maybe you've done that too. Overextending yourself quietly just to justify your presence, hoping that effort will translate into appreciation, but effort without boundaries rarely earns respect, it only raises expectations. And by the second month, the tone had changed, not sharply, just enough to sting if you were paying attention. Sighs when I entered the kitchen, quick glances between them when I spoke, small jokes that landed a little too close to truth. And every time I noticed, I swallowed it down because confronting discomfort felt riskier than enduring it. And when you've already given up your independence, you don't rush to challenge the people who control your shelter. And that's when the erasure really began, not with shouting, not with cruelty, but with invisibility, my preferences quietly overridden, my routines disrupted, my things moved without asking. As if I were a guest who had overstayed instead of the reason that house still stood. And I remember one afternoon searching for my tea kettle, the same one I'd owned for years, only to find it gone, replaced with a newer one I'd never used. And when I asked about it casually, the answer came back light and dismissive, like it didn't matter, like I didn't matter, and maybe that sounds small. But small things are how people test how much you'll tolerate, and every time you let it slide, the line moves again. And by the third month, the house no longer felt like shared space, it felt like borrowed air. Like I needed permission just to exist comfortably, and my son, the same one who had hugged me at the bank and promised to take care of me, was suddenly always busy, staying late at work, distracted when he was home. His attention glued to his phone, while I sat nearby pretending not to notice the distance growing between us. And the silence from him hurt more than any harsh word could have, because silence implies agreement. It tells you that what's happening is acceptable, that your discomfort isn't worth addressing. And I waited for him to notice, waited for him to step in, waited for him to remember who I was, but waiting doesn't stop anything. It just teaches people how long you'll endure, and the moment that stays with me, the moment I can't forget no matter how many times I replay it, happened on an ordinary evening, the kind you don't expect your life to change on. I had made dinner, his favorite, the same dish I'd cooked for birthdays and celebrations for years, and we sat at the table together, the children quiet, the room heavy with something unsaid. And then, without even looking at me, his wife spoke. Not angrily, not cruelly, but with that calm tone people use when they think they're being reasonable, saying the house felt cramped lately, that maybe it was time to discuss long-term arrangements, that if I could find somewhere else to stay, even temporarily, it might help everyone breathe. And those words landed harder than shouting ever could, because they were wrapped in logic, in convenience, in the language of solutions. And I froze, fork suspended, heart racing. Waiting for my son to speak, waiting for him to push back, to say something, anything, but he didn't. He just kept scrolling, silent, complicit, and in that moment I understood something painful and clear. That love doesn't always disappear in a dramatic moment. Sometimes it just fails to show up when you need it most. And I smiled because that's what you do when you don't want to cry in front of people who have already decided you're expendable. And I said I'd look into options, because agreeing felt safer than arguing. And that night I lay awake listening to the house breathe around me, realizing that I was already halfway gone, even though my things were still there. And over the next few days I began packing quietly, not because anyone told me to, but because survival teaches you to prepare before you're officially pushed. And I told myself this was temporary, that space would help, that things would settle, but deep down I knew something had shifted permanently. And then came the afternoon that confirmed everything. The afternoon I came home with grocery bags in my hands and found the front door locked, my key useless, my access revoked without warning. And as I stood there knocking, calling, waiting, a thought passed through me so sharp it almost hurt, that this was never about space or stress or breathing room. It was about control, and when the door finally opened and I saw my son avoiding my eyes. When I heard the words that followed, explaining why it was better this way, why I needed my own space, why my presence was too much, I realized I wasn't being asked to leave, I was being erased. And if you're listening to this thinking you'd never let it get that far, remember this: it didn't happen all at once. It happened inch by inch, silence by silence, until one day the lock changed and the truth was unavoidable. And as I stood there holding bags of food I'd bought for a family that no longer wanted me, something inside me hardened, not into anger, but into clarity, because in that moment I stopped asking why I wasn't enough and started wondering what I had already given away. And the answer to that question would change everything, because they thought locking me out ended the story. But they had no idea that the real story was hidden in the paperwork I signed long before that door ever closed. And the next time they would need me, it wouldn't be for my cooking or my patience or my silence. It would be for something they never realized I owned. What does it do to you when the place you thought you belonged suddenly treats you like a stranger? Because that's the question that echoed in my head as I stood on that porch with grocery bags cutting into my fingers, staring at a door that no longer recognized my key. And for a moment, I honestly thought it was a mistake, the kind you laugh about later, a lock changed without telling me, a misunderstanding that would clear up as soon as someone answered. So I knocked, then rang the bell, then checked my phone, texting my son that the key wasn't working, telling myself not to overthink it, but minutes stretched too long, the silence on the other side of the door growing heavier with each second. And when I finally heard the car pull into the driveway and saw him step out, his face registering surprise instead of concern, something inside me dropped, because surprise meant he hadn't been wondering where I was. And when I said I lived there, or thought I did, he didn't correct me, he didn't apologize, he just looked away. And that's when his wife appeared behind him, arms crossed, already prepared, explaining that the locks had been changed for safety, for the kids, for peace of mind, words stacked neatly like excuses rehearsed ahead of time. And I cut in because I needed to hear him say something, needed to hear my son push back. Tell her this wasn't right, but instead he stepped between us and told me calmly that it was better this way, that I needed my own space, that things weren't working, that everyone was stressed and my being there made it harder. And those words, spoken without anger, hurt more than shouting ever could, because they weren't emotional, they were final. And I remember blinking, trying to understand how the man who begged me for help in the middle of the night could now stand there telling me I was too much, like I'd somehow become an inconvenience instead of the reason his house still existed. And when I reminded him that I paid his debt, that I sold my house, that I gave him everything I had, his face tightened and he snapped back that no one asked me to, that I chose to do it, that now I expected something in return. And that's when the words came out, sharp and careless, calling me a burden, saying I'd lived off him long enough, telling me I sucked the life out of everything. And then the sentence that still rings in my ears, telling me to just go, to disappear, to die. And there's a moment when something like that is said, when time slows, when you can feel every breath, every heartbeat, every detail around you, the sound of a neighbor's lawn mower down the street, the smell of warm concrete, the weight of the bags in your hands. And I realized in that moment that I wasn't arguing with my son anymore. I was seeing him clearly for the first time, and clarity hurts worse than denial, because there's no confusion left to hide behind. And when he turned and walked back inside without another word, when the door closed and the lock slid into place, it wasn't just the house that shut me out. It was the illusion I'd been living in, the belief that sacrifice guaranteed loyalty, that love would be remembered when it mattered. And I stood there longer than I should have, not because I hoped they'd change their minds, but because I needed my body to catch up with what my mind already knew, that this chapter was over whether I was ready or not. And eventually I crossed the street and sat on a bench, setting the grocery bags at my feet, the lasagna still warm inside its pan, and I laughed quietly, bitterly, the kind of laugh that slips out when you realize you've been the punchline to a joke you never agreed to. And as the sun dipped lower and the streetlights flickered on, something shifted inside me, not into rage, but into resolve, because for the first time since that midnight phone call, I wasn't reacting, I was thinking, and I remembered something important, something I hadn't thought about in months. Something they had never once asked about, the paperwork, the documents I signed, the details no one read because desperation makes people careless. And as I stood up, straightened my coat, and called a cab, I whispered to myself that it was time to remember who owned what, because they thought locking me out had ended my role in their lives. But what they didn't know, what they never bothered to check, was that the door they slammed shut was attached to a house tied to my name, and as the car pulled away, leaving that street behind, I didn't feel broken, I felt awake, and that awareness would soon become something far more dangerous than anger. Because anger burns fast and fades, but clarity waits patiently, and the next time my son would reach for me, it wouldn't be because he needed forgiveness, it would be because he needed my signature. And that realization settled in quietly, like a promise I had no intention of breaking. Have you ever been discarded so completely that the silence afterward felt louder than any argument? Because that was the sound that followed me into the small rental apartment near the old church, a narrow place with thin walls. A single bedroom and a window that looked out onto nothing but brick, and yet it was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in months, not peaceful, not yet, but honest. Because there was no one there pretending I was welcome while wishing I'd disappear. And as I unpacked my things slowly, folding clothes into drawers that weren't really mine, setting my old photographs on a windowsill that caught very little light, I noticed something strange happening inside me. The panic that had been holding me together started to loosen, and in its place came something steadier, something that didn't demand tears or apologies, just attention. And if you've ever been pushed out of a life you built for someone else, you know that the first thing you feel isn't revenge, it's disbelief, because your mind keeps trying to return to the version of events where kindness mattered, where sacrifice meant something, and when that version refuses to come back, you're left with facts, and facts don't care how you feel. They just sit there waiting to be acknowledged. And one evening, as I reached into my suitcase for a sweater, my fingers brushed against the thick folder I'd packed without really thinking about it, the one with the bank logo on the corner. And in that moment, something clicked, not dramatically, not with music or a gasp, just a quiet shift, like a light being turned on in a room you didn't realize was dark. And I sat down on the floor, legs crossed, cup of tea cooling beside me, and spread the papers out one by one, reading them the way I should have known everyone else never did, slowly, carefully, with intention. And there it was, in language so plain it almost felt cruel. My name listed where it mattered: borrower, principal, security holder, and beneath it, the address of the house I'd been locked out of, and I remember laughing again, but this time there was no bitterness in it. Just disbelief at how invisible I'd been allowed to become, because they had taken my money without ever asking what strings were attached. They assumed generosity meant ignorance, that a mother helping her son wouldn't protect herself. And maybe that assumption had worked before, but not this time, because when I sat at that bank months earlier, something in me had insisted on one small thing. A quiet condition that no one questioned because everyone was too focused on getting the money: my name on the loan, the property listed as collateral, a safety net I didn't plan to use but needed to know existed. And as I traced my finger over the printed lines, I understood something that made my chest tighten, not with anger but with power, because the paper didn't forget me the way people did. It remembered every detail, every signature, every responsibility, and while they thought I'd handed over cash, what I'd actually done was step into a position they never imagined I could hold. And in that moment, I stopped feeling like a victim of circumstance and started feeling like a participant again. And if you're listening to this wondering whether that realization felt good, it didn't, not exactly, it felt heavy. Because power carries responsibility and clarity forces choices, and I didn't want to hurt my son, I didn't want to ruin his life, I just wanted my dignity back, and the truth is, once dignity is taken, it doesn't return through apologies, it returns through boundaries, and over the next months I lived quietly, volunteering at the church pantry, taking long walks through the neighborhood, letting people know me simply as Ruth, not someone's mother. Not someone's burden, just a woman with time and steady hands, and no one called me, not my son, not his wife, not the grandchildren, and each unanswered day did something important. It showed me how quickly people adapt to your absence when your usefulness ends, and instead of breaking me, that knowledge strengthened something inside me, because when the phone finally rang again almost a year later, I wasn't waiting for it. And when I saw an unfamiliar number light up the screen, I almost didn't answer, but something told me this was the moment all those quiet months had been leading to. And as I listened to my son's voice on the other end, hesitant, careful, suddenly polite, explaining that they were trying to sell the house, that there was a problem at the bank, that apparently my name was still involved, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes because the story had finally come full circle. And the realization settled in gently that the house I'd been thrown out of wasn't just a place I once lived, it was leverage. And the people who told me to disappear were about to learn that paper remembers what people forget. And the next conversation we would have wouldn't be about family or forgiveness. It would be about terms, and I would no longer be the one begging to be let back in. Have you ever noticed how apologies sound different when the person saying them has run out of options? Because that was the tone in my son's voice when he finally spoke my name again, careful and thin. Like he was afraid the word itself might shatter, and he didn't begin with mom, not really. He began with urgency, with explanations layered on top of one another, telling me about plans and timing and how everything was almost ready, how they were trying to sell the house to move forward, to open something new, something better, and all that was missing was a small technical thing at the bank. Just paperwork, just a signature, and as he spoke faster, filling the silence I refused to interrupt, I realized something quietly devastating, that this was the first time he'd called me not because he missed me, not because he wanted to know if I was okay, but because he needed something again. And if you've ever been reduced to a resource in someone else's life, you recognize that moment instantly. The moment where affection feels transactional and regret sounds rehearsed. And when I finally asked why the bank needed me, his voice hesitated, then admitted that my name was still on the loan, that I was listed as the primary. That without my approval, nothing could move forward, and I waited not to punish him, but to hear whether he remembered what he'd said to me on that porch, whether he understood why this moment mattered. And when he finally whispered that they hadn't realized, that they thought once the debt was paid everything would be clean, I asked him gently why he thought I would help, and the silence that followed was thick and telling. Because for the first time he had no script, no leverage, no entitlement left to hide behind, and when he finally said he was sorry, that he hadn't meant what he said, that he was angry and stressed. I didn't raise my voice or remind him of the words. I simply told him that words don't fall out of people accidentally. They come from somewhere real, and the sound he made then wasn't anger or defense, it was collapse, the soft, broken sound of someone realizing the ground beneath them is gone, and I told him we could meet, not to fix anything, not to smooth things over, but to talk, and when they showed up at my small apartment days later, standing awkwardly in the doorway like guests unsure whether they'd been invited, I saw the reversal clearly, his wife's eyes red, her posture tight, the confidence she once carried replaced with something closer to fear. And I offered them tea not because I wanted to comfort them, but because I wanted to keep the moment calm, grounded, honest, and they didn't touch the cups, they just sat there, explaining the cafe dream, the investments, the timelines, the way everything depended on selling the house. And as they spoke, I listened, not as a mother desperate to fix things, but as a lender reviewing a request, and when they finished, waiting for reassurance. I stood and retrieved the folder from the drawer, the same folder that had waited patiently for this moment, and placed it on the table between us. And the shift was immediate, their eyes following it like it carried weight, because it did. And I opened it slowly, laying out the documents one by one, showing them the loan agreement, the collateral clause, my name printed clearly where theirs never was. And when I explained that the debt wasn't just paid, it was structured, that interest applied, that timelines existed, that consequences followed, the room went silent. And when I slid the final page across the table, the repayment demand with numbers they hadn't prepared for, I didn't feel cruel. I felt steady because this wasn't revenge, it was accountability. And when they protested that they didn't have that kind of money, that everything they had was tied up in the future they were trying to build, I nodded and told them calmly that futures built on erasing people rarely stand, and that if they wanted the house free and clear, the terms were simple: repay what was owed with interest or the house would be sold. And the look on my son's face then wasn't hatred, it was recognition. The moment he finally understood that I wasn't punishing him, I was treating him the way the world treats people when sentiment runs out. And as they left that day in stunned silence, I knew the balance had shifted permanently, because the person who once begged me to save him was now learning what it meant to stand on his own, and the next decision wouldn't be mine to soften. Because once boundaries are drawn, they don't bend for tears, and the days ahead would prove whether remorse could survive without leverage, because the clock had started ticking, and this time I wasn't the one running out of time. What happens when the clock you warned someone about finally runs out? Because that was the question sitting quietly in my chest as the days passed without a single payment, without a miracle, without even a phone call that didn't circle back to the same pe air asyeri be for more time. And I listened, not with anger, but with a kind of distance that only comes when you've already grieved what you're about to lose. Because by then I wasn't reacting to them anymore, I was responding to reality, and reality doesn't negotiate with sentiment. It just moves forward, and when the deadline came and went like any ordinary day, I did what any lender would do, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I refused to hurt myself again by pretending consequences didn't exist, and I filed the paperwork quietly, my name steady on the petition. My hands not shaking the way they once had, and the process moved with a calm efficiency that felt almost surreal, because while emotions had torn my family apart, the law remained indifferent, reviewing documents, verifying signatures, confirming timelines, and when the judge asked me if I was certain, if this was truly what I wanted, I answered without hesitation, because certainty doesn't always feel loud or dramatic. Sometimes it feels like relief, and 2 weeks later, the house that once symbolized safety and belonging became an item on a schedule, a property to be vacated, and I didn't go there when the movers arrived. I didn't stand on the lawn or watch from across the street, because I'd already been locked out once and I didn't need to see it again. Instead, I sat at my small desk and printed a single photograph. A picture of fresh ground and wooden frames rising from it, the foundation of something new, something modest but mine, and I slid it into an envelope without a note, without explanation, because some messages don't need words. And when the sale was finalized and the proceeds settled, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished, like a chapter had closed cleanly instead of tearing at the edges. And the irony wasn't lost on me that the house I'd been thrown out of was the very thing that restored my independence, because money returned with interest can't buy back trust, but it can buy back choice. And as I signed the final documents for my own home, I thought about how quickly people confuse generosity with weakness, how easily kindness is mistaken for an endless resource, and how shocking it feels when the person you underestimated finally stops absorbing the damage. And I knew my son would call again, not because I hoped for it, but because accountability tends to echo long after consequences land. And when that call came, his voice stripped of pride and pretense, asking if it was truly over, I told him the truth, that it wasn't too late to rebuild his life, but it was too late to rebuild it on my sacrifice. And as I hung up, I realized something that had taken me far too long to learn, that being someone's mother doesn't require being their foundation forever, because children are meant to stand on their own, not on the backs of the people who raised them. And the house was gone, the lesson delivered, and all that remained was the quiet work of living forward, because the next chapter of my life wouldn't be about loss or revenge. It would be about remembering who I was before I made myself smaller to fit into someone else's comfort, and that remembering would be the most valuable thing I carried into whatever came next, because once you reclaim your ground, you don't measure success by what others lose, you measure it by how steady you finally feel standing on your own. What do you do after the noise fades and the story everyone else is watching finally ends? Because that was the question that followed me into the quieter days that came after everything had been decided. When there were no more documents to sign, no more deadlines to enforce, no more explanations to give, just mornings that belonged to me again, and at first the stillness felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. Like I was waiting for another blow that never came, but slowly I began to understand that peace doesn't arrive with celebration, it arrives with permission, the permission you give yourself to stop explaining, to stop defending, to stop shrinking in order to keep others comfortable. And I filled my days simply, volunteering at the church pantry, walking the same streets until they felt like mine, learning the names of people whose lives had been overlooked. And in those small acts, I found something unexpected, a sense of usefulness that didn't demand sacrifice, a kind of belonging that didn't require silence. And when my son called again months later, his voice stripped of anger and urgency, asking if it was too late, I told him the truth gently, that beginnings are always possible, but repetition is not, because loving someone doesn't mean paying the same price twice. And as he cried, I didn't rush to fix it, because some pain is necessary for growth. And I realized then that the greatest mistake I'd made wasn't trusting him, it was abandoning myself, and the greatest correction wasn't taking the house back, it was taking my dignity back. And if you've ever been told you were too much, too old, too inconvenient, too late, hear this clearly: you are not invisible, you are not expendable, and your worth is not measured by how much you give until there's nothing left. It's measured by how well you protect what's still yours. And I don't tell this story for sympathy or praise, I tell it because silence is what allows patterns like this to repeat. Because too many people confuse endurance with love and suffering with loyalty. And if my story stays with you, let it be as a reminder that kindness without boundaries becomes permission, that clarity often arrives only after loss, and that it's never wrong to choose yourself after being chosen last, because the lesson here isn't about revenge or winning. It's about remembering who you are when no one is asking you to disappear and standing there fully, unapologetically. Knowing that your story didn't end when the door closed, it began the moment you stopped waiting for it to open again.